word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. When I feel afraid, think I've lost my way, still you're there right beside me. Nothing will I fear as long as you are near. Please be near me to the end. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. You're the light unto my path.
Hello and welcome to Sound Words. Sound Words is the theme that has been selected as a course of study for the Church Street Church of Christ this year. It is based upon some words that Paul writes to Timothy. Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share with me in the sufferings for the gospel, according to the power of God, to which I was appointed a preacher, an apostle, and a teacher of the Gentiles. Hold fast the pattern of sound words which you have heard from me, in faith and love which are in Christ Jesus. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 8, 11, and 13. In keeping with this theme, then, of sound words, this program is simply a Bible study. How better to discern sound words than to listen to the Word Himself, Jesus the Christ? So we are using this weekly time slot to simply study the Bible together. We are studying the Gospel of John. I hope that you will continue to tune in at this time each week to participate in this fascinating study. I hope you have your Bible ready so that you can follow along and possibly even take notes along the way so that you can prepare yourself for even deeper study on a personal level. In our last time of study together, we were looking at John chapter 5, primarily at verses 1 through 18, where we see Jesus, as the word picture describes, as the great physician in John chapter 5. This is, according to John's Gospel, the third sign that Jesus performs. This one demonstrates his mastery over time because he gives the ability to walk to a man who has been lame for 38 years. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the kind of healing Jesus is performing in this case. It's not simply the removing of a physical disability, but the removing of a spiritual disability as well. He challenges this man's inner hopelessness and tries to give him a reason to move on in his life with hope and reason and purpose for living. So it's a great story that we find in John chapter 5, verses 1 through 18. From there last week we went on to verses 19 through 29, which according to the religious leaders of Jesus' day is a time when Jesus is making some pretty outlandish claims about his relationship to God. It's a pretty detailed account of some specific things Jesus says that really irritate the religious leaders. They feel like Jesus is putting himself in a position that is equal with God. Sometimes, even though we don't necessarily use this word much in our language today, we are confused about the word blasphemy. This is the number one accusation made against Jesus when he is ultimately crucified. And blasphemy to these religious leaders is exactly what Jesus begins to do here in John chapter 5, verses 19 through 29, because blasphemy is putting himself in a position where he is equal to God himself. They feel like that is very disrespectful to God. They don't necessarily believe it to be true. They feel like Jesus is some sort of subverter of truth rather than proclaimer of truth, and they see it as their responsibility to squelch every effort he makes to proclaim himself to be that long-awaited Messiah, the Son of God. So in this period of controversy in John chapters 5 and 6 that we've been looking at, we move into a section in John chapter 5 starting in verse 30 where Jesus is going to list for us 5 witnesses to verify his claims that he's just made. Remember, he's made these claims about his relationship to God in verses 19 through 29, and now in verses 30 through the end of the chapter, verse 47, he's going to be, as it were, in a courtroom scene or a trial scene, calling witnesses to the stand to verify or to confirm the things that he is saying about himself. So let's read this section, and we're going to just take it in little pieces so we can see each of these witnesses individually that Jesus, in a sense, calls to the stand. We begin in John chapter 5, verse 30, and we're going to see, first of all, Jesus' own witness. He is testifying about himself. Let's look at verses 30 and 31. Jesus says in verse 30 of John chapter 5, "I can of myself do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is righteous, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of the Father who sent me. If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true." Now that seems like an odd thing to say because most people would agree with that. They would say, well, you can't really testify with regard to yourself because you're biased with regard to yourself. But Jesus considers himself in this case to be unprejudiced because of the fact that he is not seeking his own will. But in his own words here, he is carrying out the will of another who sent him. He's not concerned about his own will, he's concerned about the Father's will. And so he does have a testimony to speak about himself that does bear listening to. So the first witness Jesus calls to his claims about his relationship to God is himself. But as we read on in verses 32 through 35, we see that we're going to be calling to the stand the witness of John the Baptist. Look at verse 32. He says, "There is another who bears witness of me, and I know that the witness which he witnesses of me is true. You have sent to John, and he has borne witness to the truth. Yet I do not receive testimony from man, but I say these things that you may be saved. He was the burning and shining lamp, and you were willing for a time to rejoice in his light." It's an interesting strategy that Jesus uses here because John the Baptist is and always has been with the Jewish people a very popular figure. John is a rather eccentric kind of prophet of sorts. He is one who very much lines up with Elijah or even Elisha in the Old Testament, this rugged wilderness type who is proclaiming a message that God has given him to proclaim. And he's sort of an outcast. He's sort of a hermit of a type. And people are intrigued by that. People are drawn to that. And so John the Baptist is very popular to many people. And so Jesus is going to lift up John the Baptist as an example or as a witness to the very things he's claiming about himself. This appeal to John the Baptist is really directed to popular opinion. He knows that they respect John the Baptist. So since Jesus' audience accepts John as being unquestionably truthful and accurate in the things that he has to say, then logic demands that they should accept his verdict concerning Jesus. They should believe the things that John the Baptist has to say. The next witness that Jesus calls to the stand regarding his claims to the Father is the witness of his own works. Look at verse 36. In verse 36, Jesus continues by saying, "But I have a greater witness than John's, For the works which the Father has given me to finish, the very works that I do, bear witness of me, that the Father has sent me. In other words, if you don't believe my word, and if you don't even take John the Baptist's word for it, just notice the things that I'm doing. Notice the signs, for example, that have already been performed. As we've said throughout this study, John's purpose in writing this gospel account of the life of Jesus is to bring people to a point of belief simply by showing them the signs that Jesus performs. We've already seen Jesus turn water to wine in John chapter 2. We've seen Jesus in John chapter 4 heal a nobleman's son. We've seen Jesus at the beginning of John chapter 5 heal a lame man. And all of these, John the author would say, are witnesses to Jesus, that the things he says are to be believed. The reason they are to be believed is because you've seen with your own eyes the works that have been done. So let the works speak for themselves. And works, this word works as used in John, always refers to action that illustrates character. This is the very point we've been making throughout this study. It's not simply the event, it is what that event is pointing to, what that event tells us about the worker of that event, which is Jesus himself. These works are selected to portray all aspects of the divine power of Jesus and to establish as true his claims to be the Son of God. It's interesting when you go back to chapter 3, as Jesus is just beginning his conversation with Nicodemus by night, remember again what we read there in John chapter 3, verse 2, when it says, "This man came to Jesus by night and said to him," listen to this, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God." Why do they know that? Look at his explanation. "For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." So now over in John chapter 5, verse 36, Jesus is saying Nicodemus was actually right. You can believe who I am because you can see the signs that I'm performing, because no one can do these things unless God is with him. It is God who is working in me, he says. It is God who is working through me. He's not necessarily trying to equate himself with God nearly as much as he's trying to point people to God. And that's the part that the religious leaders do not understand. Next, Jesus goes to his next witness. He's going to call God the Father himself to the stand. Look at verse 37 of John 5. "And the Father himself who sent me has testified of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form. But you do not have his word abiding in you, because whom he sent, him you do not believe." This is a pretty bold statement Jesus makes to the religious leaders. He wants them to see that in addition to the indirect witness of the works themselves, he is going to appeal to the direct testimony of the Father. And he suggests that the reason that they don't believe him is because they don't listen to the Father, that they are not really his people. And then finally, Jesus is going to appeal with the longest section here, verses 39 through 47, to the witness of the Scriptures themselves. Look at verse 39. Jesus says very pointedly, "You search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and these are they which testify of me. But you are not willing to come to me that you may have life. I do not receive honor from men, but I know you, that you do not have the love of God in you. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, him you will receive. How can you believe who receive honor from one another, and do not seek the honor that comes from the only God? Do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. There is one who accuses you, Moses, in whom you trust. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" Very pointed statements being made here by Jesus to the religious leaders, because they lift up Moses and specifically the law of Moses, the things that Moses wrote for the people to follow, words of God himself. They hold all these words to to be true. They hold all of these words to be sacred. And yet Jesus says, how can you hold to these words as being true, as being honorable, as being sacred, when they speak of me? If you don't listen to me, then you're not listening to Moses, because Moses wrote about me. The plainest and most accessible witness to Jesus' claims is the Scriptures themselves. And so Jesus is attempting here to point out the inconsistency of professing to study the law, but then turning around and rejecting him, because the law speaks of Jesus and points to Jesus. Jesus makes a definite claim to be the very object of prophecy in the Old Testament. And the reason he does that is because there are no less than 18 unmistakable references to the Old Testament that occur in this text of John. John is using those Old Testament references to connect to Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, that he is the long-awaited Messiah of prophecy. These 18 unmistakable references to the Old Testament in John's text are given as a direct application to Christ himself. And so Jesus, once again, is pointing out the inconsistencies. You can't follow the Scriptures. You can't read the Scriptures and not believe in the Christ. So as we look back over where we have been in John chapter 5, the chapter began with Jesus' third sign recorded by John of the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. But from there we went on to listen to Jesus make some bold claims about who he is in relationship to God. Some claims that stir up the ire of the religious leaders of the day, that cause great controversy between Jesus and these religious leaders. And while they are discussing these things with one another, Jesus then turns the scene into sort of a courtroom, is the analogy that we've made together, and he's going to call to the stand 5 different witnesses to verify the claims that he has made in verses 30 through 47 of chapter 5. We've seen him call the witness concerning himself. He himself takes the stand, in other words, and he says he can do that without prejudice because he's not operating according to his own will. He's operating according to the will of his Father. He calls the witness of John the Baptist in verses 32 through 35. He calls the witness of his own works that they have seen with their own eyes in verse 36. He calls the witness of the Father himself in verses 37 and 38. And finally, he calls to the stand the witness of the Scriptures in verses 39 through 47. All of these things, either independently or together, Jesus says will verify the claims he has made about his unique relationship with God. So John chapter 5, Jesus is the great physician because of the healing of the lame man, but there is so much more packed into the latter part of this chapter where Jesus now starts doing some self-identity with not only the religious leaders, but also in the hearing of the common people, trying to get people to understand through the signs that he is performing that they can believe he is the Son of God, and that believing that truth, they can have life in his name. As we turn John's Gospel to chapter 6, we're going to see here 2 more signs that John is going to record. There are 2 signs performed by Jesus in John chapter 6. The first will be the feeding of the 5,000 in verses 1 through 15, and the second will be Jesus walking on the water in verses 16 through 21. Following those 2 signs, there's going to be probably the longest recorded speech or even sermon that we have of Jesus. It's a discourse that he makes about himself being the bread of life that is based upon the things that have actually happened in the scene where he feeds 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So John chapter 6 is a longer chapter. It is one that's going to be filled with many good things that we need to process and think about. Let's think about our word pictures where we have been so far. John chapter 1, Jesus is the Son of God. John chapter 2, Jesus is the Son of Man. John chapter 3, Jesus is the divine teacher. John chapter 4, Jesus is the soul winner. John chapter 5, Jesus is the great physician. And when we get to John chapter 6, the word picture is Jesus is the bread of life. This whole chapter is going to be around that theme of the bread of life, which begins obviously with the scene of the feeding of the 5,000. It's impressive to notice that out of all the miracles Jesus performs during his earthly ministry that are recorded by either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, there is only one of these miraculous signs that Jesus performs that is recorded in all four of the Gospels, and that is the feeding of the 5,000. There's something very significant not only about this miraculous event, but about what that says about Jesus, the sign itself. And Jesus is going to do a beautiful job in John chapter 6 of trying to make that connection for us. He wants us to see as we read his power in using the 5 loaves of bread and the 2 fish to feed more than 5,000 people, but more importantly, his ability to himself be the bread of life upon which all people can feast to find real life, real hope, real meaning for life through him as he points the way once again to God. He is the bread of life. So I'd like for us to read this section, verses 1 through 15, in what is probably for many a fairly familiar story. Let's begin in John chapter 6, verse 1. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." Therefore when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So again, this is the one sign that is repeated by all 4 of the gospel writers. It is the sign on which Jesus' discourse on the bread of life depends, and we'll see that discourse in the latter part of chapter 6. It is this occasion that Jesus uses to test the personal reactions of his own disciples. John uses this event to mark the pivot at which popular favor declines and individual faith on the part of the disciples begins to emerge. Jesus is at the peak of his popularity when he takes 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish, a young boy's lunch, and feeds 5,000 men plus women and children with this very small amount of food. As he does so, the people are obviously wowed. Jesus is very popular. The people are curiosity seekers. They want to see him perform more, and so he is at the peak of his popularity. But we'll see by the time we get to the end of John chapter 6 that that popularity turns very quickly. And Jesus' own disciples are even going to be tested to find out how much they truly believe, not just in Jesus' power to do miraculous things, but on what those things suggest Jesus has the power to do with regard to those who follow him. So again, this event marks the peak of Jesus' popular favor. The people, as a matter of fact, we just read in verse 15, seek to take Jesus at this time by force and make him king. That's what they want, because they want him to continue to do the things he's doing. This is a spectacular sign. It demonstrates Jesus' sufficiency even in the midst of what appears to be deficiency. Jesus can provide what people need. It is an educational step in the faith of at least two disciples. We see Philip named here sort of as a statistical pessimist. He's very sure of what cannot be done, but he has no vision for what can be done. But by contrast, we also see Andrew, who tends to be the ingenious optimist. He has hope when he finds this young boy with a small lunch that something might be done. He's not exactly sure what to expect, but he thinks Jesus is capable of doing something. So to Philip, this sign reveals the superiority of Jesus to statistical impossibilities, and to Andrew it shows that Jesus can justify any amount of faith that is placed on him. And so some wonderful things are happening not only with the miracle itself, but also in the minds and in the thinking of Jesus' closest disciples. Because let's not forget, they are seeing these things as well. And we're told here in this text that Jesus asks some questions of his own disciples that he already knows the answer for. He knows what he is about to do. There is no mystery as far as he is concerned, but he's laying that question out there because he wants to see what his disciples think. He wants to see what they believe about what he is capable of doing. And Philip demonstrates his pessimism, thinking this can't be fixed, while Andrew is not exactly sure what Jesus can do, yet appears to believe Jesus can certainly do something. So it's a wonderful story, and we'll talk more about it next time. But that's all the time we have for today. I hope that you'll be with me again next week. Thank you for this time we've shared together. You have been listening to Sound Words, a presentation of the Church Street Church of Christ in Lewisburg, Tennessee. I am Kyle Bolton, the pulpit minister at Church Street, and I would like to personally invite you to come and share times of Bible study and worship with us each week. We meet every Sunday at 9 o'clock a.m. for our morning worship, followed by our Sunday school for all ages at 10:15 a.m. Then we meet again at 6 o'clock p.m. for our evening worship. We also have a midweek meeting for devotion and Bible study on Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. I hope to see you there. Have a blessed day.
Holy words, long preserved for our walk in this world, they resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart words of life, words of hope. Give us strength, help us cope in this world where'er we roam. Ancient words will guide us home. Ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart holy words of our faith, handed down to this age, came to us through sacrifice. Oh, heed the faithful words of Christ. Holy words, long preserved for our walk in this world. They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you. We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart ancient words ever true, changing me and changing you.
We have come with open hearts. Oh, let the ancient words impart. We have come